The Norfolk coastal town of Great Yarmouth was, by the end of the 19th century, a very busy and popular seaside town, but was coming to a crossroads in its life. Its fishing fleet, whose catch of herring was the town's bread and butter, with its hauls being considered some of the best in the country, a line of work that had been passed down the generations since the 12th century was starting to decline, spelling possible disaster, not just for the men who went out risking life and limb in the cold of the North Sea, but also for many of the town's women, who worked in the industry of packing and processing these catches. But as one door closes, another opens, they say. And for Yarmouth, this was the growing trade of holiday makers, with, by 1900, the town having 2 piers, an aquarium, winter gardens, a bicycle railway, a revolving tower, and much, much more, to pull people in from all over the country, and in many ways was the perfect seaside town as 1900 dawned. But before the year was out, the town would be rocked by a murder. It was 6:15 a.m. on the 23rd of September 1900, and one of the town's locals, a 14-year-old called John Norton, who lived on Boreham Road, was walking along the beach on his way for an early morning swim, when he came across a strange sight among the scrubby land of the South Beach dunes. It appeared to be a woman asleep on the beach. Now today, after a Saturday night out in Yarmouth, this might not be the most shocking discovery, but for the Victorians, something like this was unthinkable. Getting closer to investigate this sight, young John made a shocking discovery that sent him running off the beach looking for the nearest policeman. He returned with a police officer named Manship, who, overlooking the sight, confirmed this terrible discovery. The woman was dead, laying on her back, her skirt ruffled up past her knees in the struggle as she was strangled to death. The weapon? A simple 9-inch long molehair bootlace taken from one of her own shoes, was still tied tightly around her neck. But who was she? Investigation soon began to discover the identity of this currently unknown victim. As police spread out around the town, the rumour mill went into overdrive, and it didn't take long for her to be traced back to the boarding house of Mr. and Mrs. Rudham, in number 3, row 104 of South Quay, where she was recorded to be staying with a young daughter named Ruby, under the name Mrs. Hood, although further investigation soon brought to light this was an alias. Her real name was Mary Jane Bennett, and she was from London. But what exactly had brought her from the capital to Great Yarmouth? The reason for her arrival and the prime suspect in her murder soon became one and the same: her estranged husband, Herbert. Mary Bennett was born Mary Clark, and she had worked as a music teacher before she had met her husband Herbert, a petty thief from West Ham. He is reported to have had an early education, but even from a young age sought to make himself better than those around him. He had very big ideas for one of his station. Sometimes he would talk so grandly that even people who knew him best believed that he was on the point of receiving some exponentially good appointment, or was about to inherit enormous sums of money. It wasn't long until his education was suffering, and he spent more time in the dance halls and music venues of the capital than he did the classroom, where he became very talented on the piano. And it is through this he first met Mary. She was of slightly higher social standing than him, but with a mutual love of music, she soon took Herbert up on his offer to teach her piano, and a relationship blossomed between the pair. As was pretty common for the time, they soon married, with the couple tying the knot in West Ham Registry Office on the 22nd of July 1897, Mary aged 20 and Herbert 17. It was a hasty and rushed marriage of necessity to save them from scandal, as Mary had fallen pregnant. It would also prove to be a marriage that would be plagued with trouble and unhappiness, almost from the very start. First, as was a common theme with Herbert, he had somewhat embellished his living standards. He'd often talked about owning a detached house with his own garden while they were courting, only for the truth to be a small terraced house that he shared with his aged grandmother, and from here things would only get worse. Sadly, their first child, the very reason they had to marry, was stillborn. Herbert tried to go straight, but struggled to put his life of petty crime behind him. At first, things seemed promising, working as a shop assistant and an odd job man, before moving on to working in canvassing sales for sewing machines. and given his reported gift for the gab, this job suited him well, and he was soon doing very well off the commissions. Then his criminal ways raised their head again, and he decided to stop passing the sales on up to his employers, instead keeping all the money for himself. When this was discovered, he was promptly let go. In search of work, he turned to Mary, largely taking her away from her legitimate job and her love as a music teacher, and pulling her more into his world, leading the pair to running several businesses and taking on deals that just got more and more shady. Herbert was a man to never say no to getting a bit of money, no matter how unlawful or unethical it may be. Their first business was buying cheaply made violins, upping the prices, and selling them under names of far better models to unsuspecting customers. After this, for a time, it seemed they were about to go straight, when Herbert took his money and bought a small greengrocer's shop, only for it to mysteriously burn to the ground shortly after he had it insured. At some point during this, his grandmother died, not leaving much in the way of money or possessions, except her prized necklace and jewellery, which she gave to Mary. What money they did get through the inheritance and through their work was now used for what is possibly the strangest and still a totally unexplained move. The duo left their newly born daughter Ruby with a friend and boarded the ship bound for South Africa. A long and still fairly arduous journey at the time, made all the stranger by their choice to stay in the country for just 4 days before returning home to London. Theories on their short stay have varied, from arriving to find a job that had been promised never truly existed, or that Herbert's conman ways didn't fly in the Cape as well as they had in London, or, as you will see later, it stretching to the more conspiratorial. Their return also seems to mark a turn in their relationship, or at least it was the first time it was noticed. Possibly things had been going south for a while, or maybe it was the constant time together on the ship that had forced them over the edge, but arguments were now commonplace. Many minor and largely innocent, but others had much more of a sting in their tail. Whatever kind of man Herbert had been, or at least pretended to be, when they first sat down at that piano together, must have seemed a lifetime ago. He was now a bullying and controlling man, never missing a chance to find fault in the simplest things Mary had done, quick to anger at her, even in public, and is said to have beaten her on several occasions. Their landlady of this time would later go on to say she had heard Mary yelling at him that with everything she knew, she could easily have him locked away for at least 15 years, before breaking down and wishing she was dead, only for him to reply, if she didn't watch what she was saying, that would happen very soon. With this, there should be little shock that it did not take long for the couple to split up. Mary kept their daughter, while Herbert moved out, taking a job in the Woolwich Arsenal, and moving in with another woman, Alice Meadows, who worked as a parlour maid. He never told her the truth of his life, but, as you probably expect by now, the one thing he took with him was his braggart ways. And to all who knew him in his new life in Woolwich, he was a man of some small means, but a well-seasoned world traveller, and more importantly, the go-to expert on South Africa. A topic that must have made him popular in the local pubs, as by now the Second Boer War had erupted in the Cape. Great Yarmouth first properly enters this tale in the summer of 1900, although a couple of sources suggest that maybe he and Mary had visited once or twice in the past, but I've been unable to find anything concrete on this matter. Herbert decided to take Alice there for a holiday in August. Given that he was still working at the Royal Arsenal, and with the Second Boer War raging, Herbert's work was undoubtedly busy, and how much he had seen Alice, as he was probably working overtime, is unknown. But it could explain his actions in Yarmouth, or how he was able to splash out on such a trip. All the way from London to Yarmouth they travelled first class, and, as a Victorian courting couple who were not yet married, booked into 2 separate rooms in the Crown and Anchor Hotel, where they spent a week. One local spoken to later said of them, "A nicely behaved couple. I often saw them strolling along South Beach. They were a model of what engaged people should be." The couple enjoyed their time in the town, and to top it off, Herbert proposed to Alice, who, knowing nothing of Mary, his child, or the fact he was still married, happily accepted. While this soon-to-be wed couple made nice in Great Yarmouth, and planned their wedding back home in Woolwich, in her home in Bexley, his real wife was getting tired at looking at the same 4 walls. Mary wrote to Herbert saying she wanted to go on holiday to the seaside. and given she still held some leverage over him that could see him locked away for a long time, Herbert agreed to pay for it. It is unknown whose idea the location was, but Great Yarmouth was chosen. He even gave her the address of a lodging house he had intended to use with Alice, only to find them fully booked in August. So, just a month later, Mary herself, along with her daughter, boarded the train heading for Great Yarmouth. During the later trial, it would be argued by the prosecution that Herbert's kindness in paying for the trip and suggesting where she could stay was really done so he knew exactly where Mary was when the time finally came. She arrived at the Rose lodging house on the 15th of September, not only inventing her name, but an entire backstory for herself, telling the landlady, Mrs. Rudrum, that she was recently widowed and had travelled up to meet her brother-in-law. Mrs. Rudrum later recalled her impression of Mary. The only thing that I noticed about her was she wore a long silver chain around her neck and had an old-fashioned watch. She was not the kind of woman that you would notice very much. She was very fond of her little girl and had no other thought other than keeping her amused and happy. Little is really known about Mary's last few days in Great Yarmouth, other than she posed for this picture taken by beach photographer Marshall Hall, and that she was often out and about around the town, but doing what is unknown, and it seems that largely she simply blended in with the other holidaymakers. And here, once again, this tale takes an unusual turn. It was the 20th of September when Herbert announced to Alice he was travelling to Gravesend in Kent in order to visit his dying grandfather. This was a total fabrication, and where he really went if it wasn't to Great Yarmouth is anyone's guess. Back in Great Yarmouth, Mary's routine carried on much as it had the same, and is largely a mystery, until the 21st, when, thanks to the daughter of the Rudrums, who had stayed up waiting for Mary as she had a letter to give to her, heard a snippet of a conversation she was having with an unknown man, with this stranger being heard to say, "You understand, don't you? I'm placed in an awkward position just now." She heard little more spoken between them, and handed Mary the letter as soon as she came in. According to some sources, the letter was asking to meet Mary at 9 p.m. the following day. Although it seems this letter was never found, so possibly this is just a little invention that has made its way into the story. The evening of the 22nd of September, Mary's last evening alive, she asked Mrs. Rudrum if she could take care of Ruby, as she wanted to go out and meet someone for a drink, to which the landlady agreed. She left the property dressed well, in her jewellery and her long gold chain. Mary bid them both goodbye and left, never to return again. Coincidentally, Mrs. Rudrum would also seem to be the last person to see Mary alive for certain, when, just popping out, she saw her standing outside the town hall near the railway station, seemingly waiting for someone around 9 p.m. that night, although others claim they saw her drinking in the pub about an hour later. And her standing near the railway station would be the last solid sighting of her until the discovery by young John Norton. But unfortunately there was another sighting which could have been her, and had people acted, maybe she could have been saved. It was around 11 p.m, and Alfred Mason and his sweetheart, Blanche Smith, were enjoying a late-night walk on the beach before turning in for the night. As they walked along, they saw another couple over by the dunes. The silence of the night was broken when the pair heard the woman yelling, "Mercy, mercy." Unfortunately, they believed it was a couple simply having a little fun and left the area rather quickly. The next morning, as the sun rose, Mary's lifeless body was found. Although she was quickly discovered to be Mrs. Hood, thanks to Mrs. Rudrum, who, after learning about the discovery of the body on the beach from a neighbour, and worrying that she had not seen Mary since last night, rushed to the local police station where she identified the body, where she would also inform the police that her necklace had been taken. Her true identity would take far longer to determine. Her room at number 3 was searched, and very little was found. Only a tag from a laundrette marked 599, and an old envelope which bared a Woolwich postal mark. And from here, some form of investigation could begin. Here, Herbert and his once again strange actions re-enter the frame. On the afternoon of Sunday the 23rd, he returned to London from wherever he may have been. But rather than heading home to Alice, he went to the lodging house in Bexley Heath, where Mary had been living before coming up to Yarmouth. Introducing himself to the landlord, he said he had come to collect whatever Mary had left behind, and to end the tenancy, as she was moving to America. After gathering her things, he returned to his home, where he gave the jewellery and clothes to Alice, telling her they were a present from a relative who no longer wanted them. The story that Mary had simply upped and left for a new life in America did not sit well with some, though, and soon she was reported missing. It was about a month before the missing woman in London and the body on a Norfolk beach were discovered to be one and the same, helped largely by the laundry mark. The Metropolitan Police took up their part in the case to help their colleagues in Norfolk, sending men into every laundrette in the Woolwich area until they found what they were looking for, a matching tag, for a Mrs. Mary Bennett. So, with Mary's real identity discovered, it did not take long for suspicion to fall on her estranged husband. You would think, with all this going on, Herbert would be trying to keep any connection with the murder as far away from him as he could, but no. He spoke of it often to his wife, her sister, and his work friends, often acting surprised and scoffing at how on earth the police had not found the guilty party yet. Little did he know that in more ways than one the noose was tightening around him. And then one day came the knock at his door. It was an inspector from Scotland Yard who'd come to search the home. During the search, a gold necklace, similar to the one that Mary had been wearing leading up to her death, was found, along with a receipt from the Crown and Anchor in Great Yarmouth, a wig and a false moustache. With this evidence collected, he was arrested for suspicion of the killing and taken to a local police station for questioning. As he was taken away, he initially claimed that he'd never even set foot in Great Yarmouth, but this was soon disproven by his own fiancée and hurt his credibility greatly. When called on this, he later confessed he had spoken in haste, and yes, he had been there before, even confessing to his double relationship and saying he would freely accept the charges of bigamy against him. But the police were after more than a simple bigamy charge. His crime was far worse, and he would now have to pay for it. This crime, like so many, had gripped the nation, and many rushed to buy the daily paper to keep up with it, from the discovery to the investigation and the arrests, and then the trial, with many papers doing all they could to pronounce him guilty before any evidence had even been seen. His trial began on the 25th of February 1901 in the Old Bailey, overseen by Lord Chief Justice Alveston. It was originally set to be held in Norwich Guildhall, but given the strong local feeling, his defence argued that he would not be given a fair trial so close to Great Yarmouth, and had it moved to the capital. It would last for a total of 6 days, and saw 30 witnesses called to the stand. During the trial, Herbert never took the stand in order to defend himself, but while being held had argued that he had been working at the Royal Arsenal at the time of the killing, even producing time cards showing he was clocked in. But 2 vital witnesses he said would back him up, as well as giving him an alibi for later on in the day when he would have been out drinking with them, both denied having seen him at all. Although a Mr. Shoto Douglas, a London businessman, did come forward and say he believed he'd seen Bennett drinking in a pub in Bexley on the night of the murder, but this helped little. Herbert might not have tried to defend himself in court, but his defence counsel and Edward Marshall Hall tried his best to save his client. Given the rather large amount of evidence against him, he had to work as hard as he could. He pointed out that although similar, the necklace found in Herbert's house and the one being worn by Mary in the beach photo, missing at the time of her body, did seem to be slightly different from each other. Given the very moral and black and white way Victorians viewed the world, especially when it came to people's lives, there was much brought up in the trial against Herbert. His past as a petty criminal, and the fact he was living with another woman who had no idea he was married with a child. In fact, it was Alice taking the stand in the trial against him that made Herbert realise all hope was lost, with his eyes dropping as he saw her, and soon sitting with his head in his hands as she told of his lies he had spun around her. Everything from where his money came from, to being a bachelor, and even that he had given her a dead woman's clothes. In truth, it seems that the unravelling of his web of deceit that he had built over years was the worst part of the whole ordeal, with one witness in the courtroom later saying it was not the murder he had committed, but the lies he had told which upset him. The thing that thoroughly doomed him, though, was the number of witnesses from Great Yarmouth who testified they saw a man matching his description around the town on Saturday the 22nd. Among them was a porter, William Reed, of the Crown and Anchor Hotel, who said he saw a man he believed to be Herbert, recognising him from his stay the month before, rushing into the hotel around midnight, looking for a room and telling him that he had arrived on the last train and would be leaving again on the first. Much was also made of the use of a fake name and backstory. Was Mary trying to escape him, only to fall victim to giving him one final chance? Or were the pair running some scam together, only for a robbery gone wrong to bring it all crashing down? Later on, theories were also thrown around that the killing was to cover up a far more treasonous act. Given his job working at Woolwich Arsenal, and the rather strange short trip to South Africa some years before, this led some to believe Herbert was secretly in league with the Boers of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, either aiding in the supplying of them of ammunition and weapons, or sabotaging supplies going to British troops. Although, other than to sell books and papers in the following years, little credibility has ever been given to this theory. It had been a marriage that had lasted over 3 years, a murder that took but a few moments, and a 6-day court case, but it took the jury just 35 minutes to decide on their verdict. Herbert was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. As sentence was passed, he spoke, for the one and only time during the whole 6 days, saying to the judge, "I say I am not guilty, sir." While Herbert awaited his fate, Marshal Hall tried to fight for his client's innocence, going as far as to say witnesses had been paid for their statements, and even trying to get the Home Secretary to overturn the verdict. But all protests fell on deaf ears. Herbert was doomed. He was taken to Norwich by train, the same route he had taken with Alice for their holiday, and when he went to do away with Mary, only this time handcuffed to a police officer. He met his death on the hangman's rope on a chilly day on the 21st of March 1901, at Norwich Jail, formerly on Earlham Road, by James and Thomas Bilton. His was the second execution to be carried out at the site. He still proclaimed his innocence the whole time up to the very end. The Eastern Daily Press reported that he twisted for 2 minutes after taking the drop, after which he was cut down and buried in the prison grounds in an unmarked grave. Mary Jane Bennett was laid to rest in the northwest area of Yarmouth Cemetery. For many, the case was closed and justice had been served, but others, both locally and nationally, doubted his guilt, with the more superstitious believing the sight of the flagpole at Norwich Prison breaking as the black flag was raised to mark the moment of his death indicated a grim omen that an innocent man had just been sent to his death. But were they right? Time moved on, and most largely forgot about the killing as the world advanced around them. Until the summer of 1912, it all came rushing back for the people of Great Yarmouth. It was the early hours of the 15th of July, and just 400 yards away from where Mary had been found, an almost identical discovery was made. This time the victim was 18-year-old Dora May Gray, who lived with her aunts at the end of Manby Road, near the town market, after being abandoned by her parents as a child. Once again, the death was strangulation with a bootlace tied around her neck. Only this time her own stocking had been removed and tied over to cover the bootlace. And rather strangely, her gloves were found further up the beach near the monument to Lord Nelson, leaving many to believe this is where she was killed and her body moved. A number of arrests were made into this new killing, and 3 men confessed to Dora's murder, but all were dismissed as attention-seekers and fantasists. No one was ever found guilty of the killing, and the case was never solved. She was buried in Caister Cemetery. Her story, although sad, is interesting, and would not be right to try and fit it in as a simple epilogue into Mary's life. So we will return to her another day. But those who supported Herbert were keen to claim this proved the real killer was still out there. But nothing came of it at the time or with more recent investigations, including by a BBC programme, Murder, Mystery and My Family, in 2018, who found there was not enough evidence to call the original trial into question. As it stands, Herbert is still considered guilty of his wife's murder. As for Dora, if her murder was an accidental or deliberate copycat killing, or indeed Great Yarmouth at one time had the beginnings of its own serial killer roaming the streets in the 1900s, will probably never be known. The site where Mary was discovered is no longer visible to the public. It is covered up by the roller coaster that makes up a large part of Great Yarmouth Pleasure Beach. But her grave is well marked and can still be found in Yarmouth Cemetery, between Kitchener and Ashcourt Roads. The area where Herbert was buried is now long gone. His final resting place located somewhere under Norwich's Catholic Cathedral, built on the old prison site in 1910. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was the Great Yarmouth Shoelace Murder, and this was a little bit of history.